Okay, so for today's podcast guest, we have Jonathan Andrew from Resilicom. We've had the pleasure of Jonathan being our first guest in our offices since lockdown began last year, and we've been discussing exciting new communication projects using the Innovasi real-time water quality monitoring system and Jonathan's hurricane-proof pod, something I'm sure we'll be touching on during this episode.
So welcome, Jonathan. Thanks very much for coming to the OrcaPod and being our very first guest.
Hey, thanks for having me down.
Our pleasure. Perhaps could you just, for our listeners, just a brief explanation about who you are, who you work for, and a bit about what you do in the industry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, I'm Jonathan, and I work for Resilicom, and a very new little technology startup based really to prototype and to test a variety of hurricane-resilient communications. And the main project we're working on initially is a subsea pod that can go under the water and house a variety of very sort of sensitive, usually potentially somewhat vulnerable comms equipment, radios and hubs and things, but with the ability to deploy antennas on top of either the pod itself or the channel markers or other marine architecture that the pod itself is deployed on. And the idea will be that although nothing is, completely hurricane resilient, because a bad enough hurricane will knock everything down, the goal is this will be the last thing standing.
Fantastic. I'm sure it's a piece of technology that's going to be very useful. So it feels like these days there's a lot more hurricanes, or is that just me? It seems there's a lot of bad weather that's been ramping up. I wonder if that's climate change related.
More temperature, there's more energy in the atmosphere, it builds up the...
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure you know all about it.
I'm not a scientist, but I definitely keep abreast of the changes, and it certainly feels to me like it's more.
Mm-hmm.
We'll touch on some later on some of my hurricane experiences as a kid growing up in Bermuda, where I was born and raised. And the threat is the same now as it was then on one level, but I think the frequency of storms are far more, and from what I can see, the strength of them is quite significant.
The intensity increases.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. I think I'm also noticing, and this is something I think we all need to pay attention to, is that the I don't know whether it's a change in the somewhat of the direction of the Gulf Stream, but I'm looking at the US hurricane situation, which affects us in Bermuda because we're right near the coast of the US. Whereas traditionally, I just remember hurricanes hitting from Florida up to the East Coast.
Yeah.
But now we're seeing storms on a really regular basis that are actually landing and going to the left of Florida on a more frequent basis.
Due to the weakened current going, because that usually carries them across the Atlantic, doesn't it?
Maybe that's it. I'm a sort of very amateur storm watcher, as others in my family are, and I'm just looking. Storms hitting places that aren't used to getting the frequency and the strength of storms.
And not prepared for it, I suppose.
Well, that's the thing. And resilience and redundancy are, they're often the last thing on the list because they're the least sexy sometimes and they're the least obvious because you only notice them when they go wrong. But I think, they're, as you guys know as well in the work you do, it's ever more important now.
Absolutely. So how did you get into the industry? Obviously, it's quite a niche merger of sciences and technology. How did you get into, obviously telecommunications is one thing, but also marrying that with kind of marine industry?
Sure. So most of my time, I was a teacher many years ago, and I went sideways into the youth charity sector and worked in the children and family support charity sector for a long time. And I just found myself regularly working with some of the technology side of it, and it's always just been an interest. I'm no scientist or engineer by training, but I've always been a sort of amateur enthusiast. And I had the chance as a sort of, on the management side, to help start up a thing called Short Mobile, which is essentially, it wears a number of hats, but we're looking at addressing rural connectivity issues. So, there shouldn't really be a difference these days between a rural community and an urban community in terms of the ability to communicate, ability to access the internet. It's gone from a nice to have to a must have. Yeah. I know that sounds like a bit of a soundbite, and probably it is, but what better place to deploy it?
Absolutely.
I mean, you, same as me, I grew up in Somerset, so down in the country, and I used to go and sit on the swing at my back garden trying to get mobile reception on my phone.
That's the one.
And now it's not a problem anywhere.
It is getting a lot better. Yeah. Well, there's been a huge push to improve that because it is an absolute must. And all credit to the UK as a whole, because there's so many different attempts by government, by BT and others, and a lot of, we've seen some really clever small startups try and tackle it as well. Because I know you see, it's actually quite similar to a lot of the ocean-based deployments that I know you guys work with. It's one thing to deploy in Scotland, it's another thing to deploy in the Caribbean. And they each present their own challenges. And the same thing is with rural areas. They're all very different, and they have their own nooks and crannies and challenges.
Indeed, something I've found that quite recently. I've just moved house a little bit further away from Portsmouth, and because it's a new build area, a lot of the providers haven't kind of expanded their range into that area, so I don't get signal inside my house.
Really?
Yeah, I have to go stand by the window, and if I wanted to make a call, for example.
Absolutely, and that's a great example of how it's better in some rural areas, but in some of the new build areas, it's an issue. And I don't know whether that's because previously maybe those new build areas were rural. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Leithen doesn't even have a working postcode at the moment.
I was just saying,
oh my gosh,
Google Maps doesn't recognise.
No way.
One letter either side of the end of my postcode letter, it works. But although that actually said that yesterday, I came home and I typed in my postcode, so I went up to see my parents somewhere, and it did recognise my address, but the postcode alone it won't recognise.
How funny!
Which is very strange. So
Crazy.
I've been hounding Google Maps trying to get them to change it.
Gotta get it done. Innovating postcodes. That's something I've never heard of.
Yes.
So one thing we wanted to ask you is I think you probably touched on it earlier with me and yourself when we went for lunch, but what has been a personal career highlight for you so far?
It's a great question. Most of my career has been in the charity sector, and so I've generally had the chance to work with some really extraordinary people, really, really extraordinary people. I think also a real highlight has been to see, really, in whether it's the charity sector working more with government and the private sector, or whether it's on the more technological side, where you've got different fields working together more and more. Those are highlights, not just because it sort of, again, sounds good in a sort of, interview type context, but it's actually, there's an awful lot of fun, and you can achieve a lot in a much shorter period of time. And really, I think we have a lot of false boundaries between industries and between companies. There's a lot of stuff that is a shared goal that actually, if you work it backwards, or rather you have apparently competing interests, when you roll it back a little bit, you've actually got a lot of shared goals, and it's and I'll use that maybe to segue into the pod, is where, if that's okay to talk about our first little invention at Resilicom.
Absolutely.
We're very proud of it. We're proud that we're going to be able to deploy subsea in a way that maybe hasn't been done before, and proud that we're looking really to try and build resilience and looking to make things stronger than they've ever been in terms of day-to-day communications for individuals and businesses. But the cleverness of the pod isn't in the pod itself. We're not reinventing any wheels at all. The cleverness is in the kit that we can deploy inside. And whether that's RF radios for cellular and mobile and IP, internet protocol communications, so internet comms, or whether it's deploying the quite focused and really, really impressive sort of marine monitoring kit of all different kinds that are there. We've started doing one thing, but actually, if we're going to have internet offshore in marine communities, wherever we deploy them, a couple of miles offshore where maybe the internet wasn't reaching before, there's all sorts of opportunities that open up. It would be fantastic that we've been, the thing we've been talking about today, of could we deploy live marine monitoring, not so much, as brilliant as it is, projects that have something deployed that take half a day to get to, but live data ongoing, it'll be easier to do longer term, and we're going to get a lot more information out of it. And you guys are the experts in live data, so I don't want to stray too far into the contrast between the two. But I'd love to hear from you guys in that sense, because I'm impressed by the marine monitoring field I'm very recent to coming to. But there's so much I don't know, and it's the idea of live marine data is something that I've only recently thought about, and I can't get my head around it quite really in terms of its potential.
It's something that we ourselves as a company have had great opportunities with salmon farms, and you can see the different. So we have a current profiler, and you can see the currents coming in, you can see the temperature, and you can see all of the things that. One, as a aquaculture company, you have to monitor to make sure you're not impacting the environment, and also for the health of the fish. So you can see that dissolved oxygen levels, like I mentioned to you earlier, our system, it can set an alarm up. So if your dissolved oxygen falls below their threshold, you can get out there and switch on the dissolved oxygen system and protect the fish, which years ago you've got a handheld device, you go out there,
Yeah.
it's manual labour, it decreases the time that you're spent in the farm.
Exactly.
And it's just up and coming technology, really.
It's amazing. I mean, our backgrounds are quite different compared to what we've got into now, science and technology. But as an undergrad studying about marine vertebrates like whales and dolphins, you never in a million years think that you could know in real time what is happening in the ocean to such a minute accuracy and resolution.
Absolutely.
It's incredible.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So we'll kind of move that on. Obviously, you mentioned that the pod, and obviously that's a new development for you, and that's something that's being, should we say, deployed and kind of developed over in the Caribbean, which is where you yourself are from.
I was born and raised in Bermuda. Yeah, proud Bermudian. I've been over here for a long time now, so my voice sounds a bit odd probably to your average Bermudian, and I've been here for about 20 years now in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Bermuda it's so similar to a lot of Caribbean environments, even though it's about 3,000 miles further north. But this was certainly developed as an idea, really from growing up in hurricanes. And every time a hurricane hits the island, you hold your breath for a day or two until you can get back in touch with people to make sure everybody's okay. And the story I often tell, and it does bear repeating, was, in the UK there was the Great Storm of '87, which Michael Fish, poor guy, in his famous report that, well, the weather's not looking too bad today, and then a massive storm came through. And that was not his fault. In fact, I hadn't genuinely thought about this before, but if he'd had the kind of live monitoring data we have now, different situation.
Exactly.
But in Bermuda, that struck us as Hurricane Emily. And I just remember as a child, it was a storm. It was a Category 3, if I remember. And it may have even dropped to a Category 2. But it was an extremely slow-moving hurricane. So we got battered for about 36 hours with hurricane force winds. And everything that you can imagine would have happened. Trees down, telephone poles down. And one of the things I noticed was, and the two things that I remember really was, number one, as soon as we could get a sort of, formal response from government and agencies, we did. They were absolutely brilliant. You had guys out with the vests on, chopping down trees, and the response had to be and was immediate as it could be. But you also had a lot of people helping people. It's very much about neighbours knowing how neighbours are doing and all that sort of stuff. And so really that's the sort of the things that were in the back of my mind and have been for years, that as I started to come across extremely clever, small cell radio technology and other things, and different types of industry deployment, which are typically maybe only deployed or mostly deployed in heavy industry or the military, actually have a hell of a lot of uses for the individual and for small businesses outside those fields. And so hopefully what we're going to achieve is deploying, as I said, really clever kit in really secure pods that can help people in some really difficult times.
So you said that's your main aim with this environmental monitoring, is to better people in that situation.
Stay connected, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Keep everyone...
It's all about connectivity. And, I'm very aware that, I can't remember if I said this already or we were talking earlier, but resilience and redundancy, it's the least sexy and clever thing on the surface. Because when it works well, you don't see it, you don't hear about it. But actually, when it goes wrong, we have huge problems. Exactly. But so, and I think, one, we need to be deliberate and invest in it, whether we're a government, whether we're a community, whether we're a business. But I think also there's something about shared assets. I'm on a group, the UK Data Telecoms Task Force, and we're looking. It's a really useful collaboration where we're really looking at the issue of redundancy and resilience and trying to blend asset deployment. So, for example, when you dig up a road to fix a pipe, lay fiber. Why not?
Yeah,
just drop it in there. Those kind of things. And it's I really enjoy that work because it's very much in the spirit of Resilicom, which is about saying, look, let's deploy multiple things in the pod if we can, because you get your resiliency bit, but you can also get a lot of other benefits. We would happily help mobile network operators or IP communications companies deploy as well. If it can be useful to them, why not make their network stronger? But then also there's, it was important for us to think laterally, and the work you guys are doing of why wouldn't we deploy marine monitoring kit?
Absolutely.
It's densifying networks is the thing we talk about in telecoms and other things. But why not deploy that and increase that communication across other industries? Live marine monitoring sounds good, and we're doing it in areas that maybe we couldn't do it before. So why not? I think it's the question we often ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose one question we had was, what gave you the inspiration to start this project? And I know you touched on growing up in Bermuda as a child and the hurricanes. Would you say that was your main inspiration for this project?
I think so. I think I had been rattling around for a while. It had always been a concern ever since I moved here, really, that, hurricanes hit and you really do batten down the hatches. Every individual has boards in their windows. Not that, this lockdown we've had for COVID over here has been awful, don't get me wrong, as necessary as it was. But hurricane lockdowns are no power, no windows open, got a little window open to let the pressure out of the back, but as long as those storms are going, you don't want to have any glass in your windows looking out because it'll smash. It's full on hunkering down. And it's, and I've slightly lost my thread where I was going with that. But I remember that growing up, and that's always been rattling around in my head. And so I think that's the background inspiration.
Yeah.
That's the one that's always been there. But I think also, as I've had the chance to work with some incredibly clever people doing the work with Chort Mobile, often hear the phrase brains the size of planets, really clever, really innovative people. Really, that my thoughts sort of drifted from there back to the other issues. And I just know that things like cooling, things like strengthening in marine environments are very difficult. And I come back to that question, I guess. I haven't really thought about it before, but why not? I have always thought about, I used to swim as a kid in the water, in the sea. And, if it's raining or if there's high winds or high waves, if you're on the surface of the water, you're getting battered. But as soon as you go under, actually, it's pretty chill. So I think that's sort of, if you want the kind of muse inspiration of it all, that's where it's come from.
I can fully appreciate it. A couple of times I've been diving in my previous job, and you go down, it's a day like today. We're very blessed today in Portsmouth. It's very nice and sunny and blue sky. And we went down once, and then while I was down there, I noticed visibly that it got very dark. I was thinking, is it just me?
Yeah.
It's got cloudy, and we came up, and it was absolutely torrential, and you couldn't see further than 200 metres.
Exactly.
In the air, it was crazy. So yeah, it's a different world when you're down there. It's
totally
easy to get lost. And speaking of down there and coral reefs, obviously the changing environment, it's something that everyone's talking about these days. Obviously the Blue Planet Revolution from David Attenborough, etc. But obviously having first-hand grown up in an environment with coral reefs, what do you think is the future for them? As a scientific community, obviously, it's important for us to monitor them, but what do you think would be the most important or prevalent thing to help protect them?
That's such a good question. I'm glad you mentioned David Attenborough before, because I think we recently, I don't know whether it was a first time watch or it was a rewatch of one of his series. I think it was the Our Planet series. And we watched the bit at the end where he has a conversation, just kind of dialogue bit about the state of the environment. And the two main messages I took away were that, one, that we're having a massive effect. And if you look at the bleaching of coral reefs and the stress that are put on corals, with just even small temperature increases, and yet we're seeing severe temperature increases at sea. It's like, that's a pretty big deal. And his second message was, it's down to us. We are affecting it. And it's, one of the messages that came through really strongly was that it's very simple to look after coral reefs and the sea, leave them alone. Which I agree with to a great extent. I really, really do. But there's just so much we don't know. The damage we did, I think of the algal bloom back in the 70s, and we don't really know the source of that, because we weren't doing monitoring at the time, because we didn't know how. So it reiterates the importance to have a baseline. So in the first place, actually, know what is healthy and what's unhealthy. I think it's super important to know that, but I think also to know what we do and how it affects. It's absolutely crucial.
Absolutely.
I think one of the main issues of coral reefs is that there are so many different things that impact them.
Absolutely.
So yes, we've got these rising temperatures, but we've also got land runoff that's going in and smothering the coral. We've also got, like hurricanes, and they're disrupting the coral. And you've got, even one thing, I did my undergraduate dissertation on coral reefs and the Great Barrier Reef. One thing that I remember significantly is sun cream. We go swimming on the coral reefs, and I don't know what it is in the sun cream. It's
It's
a
certain
chemical or something that's in them, and that
Yeah.
goes in, and that disrupts the coral reef. And they have a level of tolerance, but they can't take everything. And every single year there's more bleaching, and then there's more bleaching, and they aren't coming back from that.
Yeah, exactly.
And
That's
that is
the
the main problem that we're facing, is that they can't overcome one stressor, and then we're piling more and more on.
Absolutely.
Precisely.
There's another, and this is something I'd love. I mean, we'll talk about it today, I'm sure, but let's have a conversation, multiple conversations afterwards. I agree with the rationale of the best way to look after the sea is to leave it alone. So don't mess it up in the first place. Totally get that.
Yeah.
But there's another part of me that says, actually, we've done a heck of a lot of damage.
Yeah.
And we need to be proactive, really, and
Absolutely.
think, what can we do to help restore the areas that we have, that we've done damage to? And that's easier said than done. If I take Bermuda, for example, and my history teacher growing up will probably frown if they hear this, but if I'm trying to remember rightly the different times that Bermudians as a whole have tried to help things on the island, and I'm going back hundreds of years here, I'm not talking about recent, but we had a situation where we had a cedar blight. So there was a particular mite that was killing the cedar trees. And, Bermuda cedar is just the most amazing stuff in the world. It's my favorite wood in the world to touch, smell, work with. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And the blight was happening. And so we brought in lizards to eat the mites.
Right.
But they breed. And on a small 21 square mile island, we suddenly ended up having an awful lot more lizards than we wanted. So we brought in the kiskadee, which is a kind of tropical kingfisher type bird, to eat the lizards. And it was one of those, and to be fair, it worked out in the end. We were proactive, but we were very aware at each stage that we'd intervened, because I think we brought the mites from Europe on ships, so it was our fault in the first place, if that makes sense. And so even when you can often cause problems without realizing it, and then when you try and fix them, you can go too far in one direction. And so I think a lot about that. I don't have answers for that, but I just remember those stories growing up, and I'm very aware of them, and very aware that we can't just sit back and do nothing, but we can't go crashing in and changing all sorts of things as well.
Indeed.
I think that's one thing that is a massive problem with us invasive species, and the fact that we don't know enough about what we're bringing in. Because wasn't it in Australia, I think, and they brought in
The bullfrogs.
is it a cane toad, or is it
Oh,
something?
cane
Yes,
toad.
that's
Cane
right.
toad, and they brought them in, and then they're invasive, and now they have an actual holiday to go out and it's cane toad hunting, to go and kill all the cane toad that we introduced to help the climate and the environment.
Absolutely.
But
It's funny you say that. We had, and they believe in Bermuda it was originally brought as a pet, but we have lionfish, which are traditionally, and I'm going to get this wrong, but I think they originate in the Pacific.
Indo-Pacific.
Indo-Pacific, that's right, where they do have some natural predators. But they were introduced to the Caribbean, where they had none, and there's been huge issues, and then they were introduced to Bermuda. Now, whether they came up or whether they were brought over as pets, I'm not sure we know entirely. But I only mention that because we have an annual lionfish hunting tournament, which is a day dedicated, and there's lionfish hunting clubs, and you can become qualified as a lionfish hunter. And when I get any time back on the island, I want to be a qualified lionfish hunter. I don't think it's the most complicated thing to do, but
no, there's a lot of things like it's lionfish. I think a lot of them came over the Caribbean from shipping. Obviously, the ballast water, they intake the ballast water in Indo-Pacific, and then when they restock the boat in the Americas, obviously they release the ballast water, reload with containers, and obviously that ballast water has fish and all the other marine life in there as well.
So I know the crown of thorns starfish, that's a big...
that was my next point.
Yeah, that's a massive thing that's got an impact on coral reefs, but was that introduced by us, or was that from ballast? Well, that's from us as well, but...
It's a natural becoming thing. So my previous job, again, I involved a lot of diving. We had to do a lot of crown of thorns starfish removal, which if anyone doesn't know, it's a big starfish with about 10 arms and lots of spikes all over it.
Yeah.
And they eat the coral, don't they?
They do. They basically eject their stomach onto it, dissolve the coral, the actual polyps, and then they bring it in. So sometimes when you see a coral reef that's white, it's not actually been bleached, it's just been eaten by the starfish.
Okay.
And the problem, they do naturally occur, but they have a natural predator which controls the population, which is a big snail, like about 40-50 centimetres across, called a giant triton snail.
Right.
Problem is, they've got a really beautiful shell.
Wow.
So a lot of people would collect them and overhunt them, and for natural reasons they'd die out. And then there's nothing to control the numbers. There's a couple of fish species which might go for the crown of thorns.
There's definitely 3 or 4 fish species that eat them, but they've also been overcaught and overfished, so they haven't now got that natural top-down predator.
And because
to control the numbers,
the spikes over them are covered in a toxin. If you get stung by one, it's utterly agony.
Oh wow!
So we had to be really careful with gloves and using hooks to remove them.
Yeah.
And there's been various different studies to try and get rid of them. You can inject them with vinegar, physically removing them. But another thing that I think it's AIMS, Australian Institute of Marine Science, or St Cook University or James Cook University. They were taking water which the predators had been in and introducing it into the reefs, because the starfish can sense when they have been introduced to that water.
Oh, I see.
And they did a study where you've got 2 tanks, one with a control with just normal water, and the starfish is just sat there.
Yeah.
And then they introduced the water from which there was a snail in, and the starfish goes berserk. It's trying to escape. So there's a few different ways to do it, but again, it's another thing that perhaps we have had influence on, be it either direct predation on the top-down predators or from affecting the environment, which means the predators can't thrive anymore, which has left this bloom, which just means the coral is being eaten by all these starfish, as well as being affected by everything else we've talked about today.
Absolutely.
So it takes you back to this point where there's so many things that are just
Can we be restorative with coral, do you think?
Yeah, there are groups there are coral restoration projects, and I actually did some volunteer work with a guy who lives in just outside of Southampton now, and he's been looking at growing coral onto concrete structures. So you can deploy these and the coral will naturally grow around them. I think that's how it works.
It's exactly.
And it's a project that's ongoing and looking at different substrates that they will grow into that mimic the natural environment that they grow in anyway.
Yeah.
So there is work going on.
Exactly. It's all going to be porous. Limestone as well is brilliant.
Right.
I think that obviously they've sunk ships, etc., and put limestone blocks in. But, Another thing, I was a previous job, ropes as well. They grow quite well because you can push ropes together. There's a hole, put a little broken piece of coral in, and they grow crazy. They grow a foot in a year.
Absolutely.
Some species, and it's been amazing.
It's interesting you mentioned that. So my sister, who's she works at the Bermuda Aquarium and Zoo in Bermuda, and she's a collector. So she's responsible for bringing the different things that they'll have in the tanks, and there is a collection element to it. But I know she does a lot. A lot of the room is done in the tanks and looking after fish that come in, whether they're collected for tank purposes or whether they're rescued or that sort of thing. They do all kinds of incredible work. But she's also incredibly good at growing coral. And I know that there's the 2 things that I think about when growing coral are either growing coral for a fish tank, in that kind of industry. And then there's the putting things in the ocean so that corals naturally grow.
Yeah.
The bit that I'm less clear on in my mind is in an area that has been bleached, particularly if we've done it.
Yeah.
Is there a way to take plugs or frags of coral from another place and put it where it was previously growing well? Is it as simple as doing that? Because I know that the one thing I am aware of is that it's a lot quicker and more efficient to take frags. So just like with plants, you can take a cutting and then grow from there, and you get quite a lot of really good growth quickly. Growing it from, I don't know what the seed of coral is, but growing it from, is it spores or plankton? Or you can tell I'm not a marine scientist, but growing it from scratch, if you like, takes an awfully long time, which is fine too. That's great too. But if we're talking about doing something significant quickly, I imagine fragging's the way to go. But is it as simple as putting in plugs where they were before?
It really depends on a few factors. So if a reef has been bleached, obviously it means the coral has lost its algae, which produces about 90% of the energy it needs via photosynthesis. And then if the coral does die, then obviously you've got vacant rock.
Yeah.
If that's then influxed with carpet algae, then the coral polyps can't settle.
Okay.
So then it becomes effectively just bare rock. It can't be re-inhabited.
Right.
But there's nothing to say, like Phoebe was saying, with the porous stuff like concrete, limestone, you can put those blocks in and then attach the coral onto them. And then,
and they sort of grow and spread, don't they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just for fun, when I was going back from doing the lines with the ropes,
we
would just put pieces of coral we didn't need into the reef in different places just to see what happened, and a week later you can start to see it crusting onto the rock.
Only a week later.
Yeah.
Wow.
Certain species grow, up to a foot a year. Some will only grow 2 or 3 millimeters a year, depending on the species.
Good.
But yeah,
Did you do some of that on bleached reef?
yes, yeah.
Oh, wow. Sorry, I know I'm being interviewed or answering questions, but can I ask you about that? What was the context and how did it work? And because I'm super interested. Super interested.
It was, I think that time actually, I was working for a hotel, and guests would get a metal frame, they'd come and attach corals to, and it was like they were gardening with coral.
Oh, wow. Where was this?
Maldives. I don't mention it all the time because
yes, you do. One time in the Maldives.
But it was just after then, and we basically collect coral frags and we have a bag of them. We didn't know what to do with them, so we just pop them down on the reef again, and you try and find an area that wasn't necessarily covered with algae and just put them in there and see what happened. And you'd see a week or two later, it would start to grow into the coral, and you couldn't pick it up anymore. It would be attached.
Yeah.
I can't say that would work everywhere. It only would work with certain species. So Porites is a species, a genera of coral that grows very well. It's very hardy, which is what we tend to use. Stuff that the long finger branching coral, like Aqua is really delicate, so you have to be so careful with it.
Okay.
It does grow quickly, but it's very delicate. But then the huge species that grow like massive boulders of coral, they're the ones that grow 2 or 3 millimeters a year, and it's heart-wrenching to see those go bleached. Because it's so hard to get them to grow.
Absolutely.
Size.
But that's one thing that we should note, is that if you see a bleached reef, it doesn't mean that it's dead. It just means that it's expelled that algae and it's not living there anymore. It doesn't mean that it can't come and re-inhabit it.
Okay.
So bleached reef doesn't mean that it's dead. It's whether you're having repeated bleach events every year that means that it won't ever have the chance to regrow.
Exactly. And that's one thing I saw 2 years in a row, where you get certain coral species that were bleached for a couple of weeks in April when it was warmer, and then the warm weather would pass, you get a few rain spells come through and the colour would start to come back. But it's the real extreme bleaching of the whole reefs that will kill off a lot of coral. Like in 2016, like in 98, it was serious events around the world that did it with El Nino.
Yeah.
But
so is it a question of, in your view, would it be a question of that polyp approach, or can we help algae restore itself? In the image in my head, which obviously is not going to work, I'm being facetious here, but rather than taking a new version of the coral that was bleached, can we take a syringe and squirt some algae in it? How can we help the algae restore? I wasn't being serious.
It's not.
You understand the concept?
So, in theory, you could give it a go, but really, in that kind of context with coral, it's the polyps themselves that are the determining factor. If they're stressed by temperature or chemicals on the reef, like from sun cream or runoff from farmland, if they're stressed, they're not going to want to take back the algae.
They literally expel it, they push it out, they don't want that.
But if you can return the environment to a state where it's natural, then by all means, that's
so
where
sort the stresses out.
Exactly.
It'll probably sort itself out. Okay.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. That does make sense.
I think we've definitely covered coral reefs for today.
We're going off on a tangent.
But I think that was towards the end of what we were looking. But another segment we'd like to start doing on the regular is kind of like quick fire questions. And one thing that Phoebe and I came with was desert island questions. So I'll take the first one, Phoebe.
Yeah. So if you were stranded on a desert island, even if you were stuck in lockdown in Bermuda with no electricity, what 3 things would you have to have there?
Ooh. That is such a good question. What 3 things would I have to have? Are we thinking fun stuff or survival stuff?
You have whatever you want, but
It
just
can
3 things.
Mixture of both.
Or
you can do one or the other. It's up to you.
Okay. I think the first would be some kind of knife or utility tool.
Very practical.
We'll go with that. And then the second would be, I heard a phrase once, I think it was from a military friend who said, nothing's ever broken, there's just not enough paracord. So I'm thinking paracord would be the second one.
I wasn't sure if you're going to go with paracord, zip ties, or duct tape. I was thinking it's got to be one of the 3 there.
Yeah. I'd probably go with paracord because I think you can reuse it maybe slightly more.
Definitely.
But that's all a bit that's all a bit much, I think, or a bit sort of, technical. Maybe a bottle of Gosling's Black Seal rum. Yeah, from Bermuda.
That's more
no
up my
less.
street.
Except tapping the table, which I wasn't meant to do. Sorry.
Excellent.
You can buy it at Waitrose, by the way, just so you know.
Aha.
Promotion.
Check out.
Yeah.
It's funny, I've been drinking a lot of rum recently called Twin Fin. It's beautiful. Love it.
Excellent.
Next question, what I came up with yesterday. It's kind of a two-part.
Okay.
If you're in the water, swimming around Bermuda,
Yep.
or anywhere in the world, doesn't matter.
Okay. Bermuda. We'll go with Bermuda.
What's the one animal you'd love to see in the water? Doesn't matter how often you can or can't see it. What would you love to be in the water with?
Okay. Love to be in the water with. Now in some ways there's two bits to that. So I always love to snorkel in Bermuda, and I know it's such a cliche in some ways, but parrotfish to me are just the most gorgeous things in the world. And we have loads of them on the island. You can often hear them before you see them because they crunch away at the coral. They are absolutely stunning. But what I would like to see are things that you don't get on the inner reef, because there's the odd shark, but there's no risk of shark attack or anything when you're snorkeling off Bermuda beaches. I would like to have said I've been in the water with a shark. And I don't mean a small one, I mean like a scary one. However, being a total wimp and genuinely terrified of sharks and anything that either could eat me or indeed looks mean. I don't quite know how to do that. But I joke about sharks. I love them. They are just incredible creatures.
They are.
And to see them in their own environment live would just be really cool.
Yeah.
Really, really, really cool.
Couldn't recommend it more.
Oh, really?
which then goes into my second question
Sure.
part. If you're in the water, what would you absolutely not like to see if it was next to you?
What would I absolutely not like to see? I think shark is kind of, I guess, the obvious one in terms of if I'm just paddling around and I wasn't expecting it. What would I not? Well, I mean, the thing, if I wasn't expecting it, that I would not like to see is a Portuguese man of war. We get them for a brief period on the island, and you see that if you're out swimming and you see that blue bubble. I mean, you need to check the wind because the tails will go with the wind. But that feeling of the bottle's over there, but it could be anywhere, and especially if you're a ways out and there's a whole bunch of them, that is not what I want to see.
No,
that is not what I want to see.
Very wise, cool.
I've done stung by jellyfish, but which isn't so bad. Man of war are a whole different kettle of fish, and I've seen people stung by them. It is nasty.
It's like almost like a red dotted line of tattoos that they get afterwards. It's lacerations.
Absolutely, it's lacerations. Is exactly what it is. Exactly what it is. But I've got one last little story for you on that one, just to show you how much of a wimp I am. So I was snorkeling on the island years ago, and this barracuda was not big. Let's be quite clear. He was not big. But I was intrigued by him, so I started following him, and I was quite close to the beach. And he realised I was following him, and so he sped up a little bit, and I sped up. And so he just casually turned left and went out, not far, but he swam out, and the visibility didn't happen to be great that day. And he swam out, and here I am thinking, here's me chasing a barracuda. And all of a sudden, 3 of his mates emerged, just sitting there in the water, looking back at me as he swims up to his mate, and he kind of turns around. When it was just one, it was fine. And again, these were not big fish. But that look with those teeth sticking out, and they were all just there looking at me like, okay, really? Is this what we're doing?
Are you following us?
Yeah, exactly. And what did I do? Turn around and swam back to shore. Total wimp.
Wow. And then we had our final question for you, which one that Nathan actually came up with.
Yeah.
One item of technology that you wish hadn't been developed.
Oh my goodness.
Bit controversial as this is a science ocean technology podcast.
I know. I mean, I think, again, if I could cheat and just do 2 versions of the answer.
Okay.
I have a big thing about sugar, and I think fizzy drinks, and I love Coke, don't get me wrong, Coca-Cola, but fizzy drinks, they don't help anything. They don't add, they're horrendous for health. And teeth and all the rest of it. And the worst bit is I love them. So I wish I could ban fizzy drinks. That's the thing I wish we'd never invented. I think we should stick with, water, fruit punch, and alcohol, and we'd be absolutely fine. Maybe iced tea as well. Fizzy drinks, useless. I think the other thing is that comes to mind is probably disposable plastics. I can't see that helping, but I don't want to, I don't want to just sort of wave a banner and go plastics off, because actually we've revolutionized life on the planet in a good way with plastic, and we're I think we're quite hypocritical with it. Like, in the one sense, you think, that plastic, it'll be on the planet for 1,000 years, and then if you get a plastic that does break down so that it doesn't last forever, we go, oh, look at that plastic, it's cheap, and throw it away. Well, actually, we want the same thing on both sides. So
exactly.
I think we need to get our story straight on that one, on what we actually want. Just be deliberate.
Yeah.
I think plastic's a great topic, because it's not plastic that's the problem. It's our disposable sort of attitude toward plastic that is the problem. And if we didn't have that and we use it for certain niche things that we needed it for, it'd be a completely different story.
Totally.
Yeah.
But
That's
plastics is a great one.
The source of it as well. There's
Yeah.
other ways you can make it.
So energy intensive. But
That's so true.
Yeah. Well, there we go. Well,
yeah.
John, thank you so much for joining us on our
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me down. It's been great fun.
It has been a lovely day for it, but yeah, you've been a great guest, so thank you for coming on.
You're very welcome. Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.